It's so hard to make friends with Canadians. Canadians are distant. Canadians are very polite, but too private. Ladies and gentlemen, have you ever heard these words? And if you are a newcomer, chances are you have said them as well. I am a newcomer. I came to Canada from Poland. And I've heard these words many times, but I have a different story to tell. My story is about friendship, and not one, but three. My story is about Mrs. Gregg, Mrs. Norma Stedman, and Stasia. Mrs. Gregg was a retired schoolteacher. My husband and I, met her in Terrace, a small town north of British Columbia. We met her in 1982, soon after we arrived in Canada. We couldn't speak any English. Mrs. Gregg was our first English teacher in Canada, and her living room was our first classroom. Mrs. Gregg lived in a very comfortable trailer with a bedroom, bathroom, a kitchen, living room, and a storage room full of books, piles of Canadian Reader's Digest, full of real-life Canadian stories. We had lessons every weekday. Every weekday, we started at 9 a.m. sharp. With a cup of coffee, 2-3 cookies, and a small talk, very important in Canada, small talk. And then we would go to Mrs. Gregg's storage room to choose a reader with stories so powerful, many of which we still remember. For example, Maciek still remembers this story about Canadian Mohawks working on the heights in New York. He was so impressed. And I still remember this story about a small community stranded in the wilderness in the Canadian Great North in winter, without food, and Canadian rescuers hovering above them, dropping bags full of dry beans so they could cook them and survive this harsh winter. You see, we read the stories and we talked about them. We asked questions. This is how we started to learn about the life in Canada from Mrs. Gregg. She was an excellent teacher. In exchange, we would help her in her garden, weeding and watering the plants. Once we even painted the fence. Mrs. Gregg accepted our help generously as a token of appreciation for her care and kindness and generosity. Her heart and house were always opened to us. And then we moved from Terrace to Vancouver, where we met Mrs. Norma Stedman. Or shall I say Norma? Please call me Norma. She would correct us every time we called her Mrs. We learned that Canadians prefer to be less formal. Norma was also a retired school teacher, and we met her through Mosaic, an organization helping newcomers to Canada. First, Norma would come to our apartment. She would sit in the middle of the sofa, and she would hold a reader on her laps. We would sit on both sides, taking turns to read from the same reader. Norma corrected our pronunciation. And then she would invite us to her place for lunch. Her specialty, Canadian soups, Canadian coleslaw salads, served with warm buns. Help yourself. Have another bun. She would encourage my husband to have some more food. Help yourself. This phrase I learned from Norma, because her heart and house were always opened to us. And then we met Stasia Małczyńska. Stasia and her husband and her family adopted us. Every Christmas, every Easter we would spend with them in their house. Stasia was also an excellent cook. Her specialty? Pierogi, Polish traditional dish. In summer with blueberries, in winter with meat and cabbage, with potato and cheese anytime. In her house we were at home. Stasia was more than a friend. She was like a sister, or even a guardian angel, always generous and willing to help. Even when they moved to Kelowna, we would still keep in touch and visit with them very often. Their hearts and house were always opened to us. Today, our friends are no longer with us. They have passed away, but they have not died. They still live in our hearts, our minds, and our stories.
W żółtych płomieniach liści brzoza dopala się ślicznie. Grudzień ucieka za grudniem, styczeń mi stuka za styczniem. Wśród ptaków wielkie poruszenie, ci odlatują, ci zostają. Na łące stoją jak na scenie, czy też przeżyją, czy dotrwają.
I ja żegnałam nieraz kogo i powracałam już nie taka, choć na mej ręce lśniła sroka, obrączka srebrna jak u ptaka. I ja żegnałam nieraz kogo, za chmurą, za górą, za drogą.
Ja żegnałam nieraz